Welcome back to the channel. I'm Aaron. What if this so-called de-escalation between the United States and Iran is not the beginning of peace, but simply the quietest phase before a much more dangerous escalation? Because that may be the first thing most people are getting wrong. Right now, a lot of the conversation is built around the idea that tensions are cooling, that pressure is pushing Iran towards negotiation, and that Washington is still in control of the pace of this crisis. But that assumption may be completely backwards. What if Iran is not nearly as weak as it looks? What if the ceasefire is far more fragile than it sounds? And what if the United States, despite all its military superiority, no longer has a clear path to impose the outcome it wants? That is the real story here. In this video, we're going to break down how durable this ceasefire actually is, where Iran's real leverage lies, why the Strait of Hormuz matters far beyond the Middle East, and why this entire confrontation may be exposing something much larger than a regional standoff, the real limits of American power. First, we need to be clear about what this is and what it is not. This is not peace. At best, it's a temporary suspension of momentum, a pause, a moment in which the visible intensity of the crisis has dropped, but none of the underlying drivers have actually been resolved.
Prepare for the worst, prepare for the continuation of the war. So either it's a very significant bluff on their end, or they're they're in a different mindset to us in the West.
And that distinction matters because the word ceasefire can create a false sense of structure. It can suggest that a crisis has entered a more stable phase, that escalation has been contained, that some basic political understanding now exists between the parties involved. But in this case, that may be deeply misleading. What exists here appears vague, weakly defined, and highly vulnerable to collapse. There's no solid long-term framework underneath it.
Sheet of music that you're not doing contradictory things, like you're not securing a ceasefire on one hand, but then violating the very, doing the exact opposite, because one of Iran's other demands was, hey, end the sanctions. Sanctions got to go away, because otherwise we're not going to talk.
No real foundation of trust. No shared political horizon that both sides are clearly moving toward. And when a ceasefire rests on that kind of uncertainty, it does not take much to break it. One strike, one miscalculation, one action interpreted as crossing a red line, and the entire arrangement can unravel almost immediately. That is the real issue in conflicts like this, especially in the Middle East. The question is not simply whether something has been signed, announced, or informally acknowledged. The question is how many actors involved either reject the arrangement, distrust it, or have strong incentives to sabotage it the moment it starts benefiting the other side. That is why Israel remains such a critical variable in this story. If Israeli decision makers conclude that Iran is using this to pause to recover, to rearm, stabilize its position, or even emerge with a more legitimate regional standing, then the so-called ceasefire becomes politically fragile by definition. Because at that point, the arrangement is no longer seen as a step towards stability. It is seen as a mechanism that may allow a strategic rival to survive pressure and regain space. And once that perception takes hold, the value of the ceasefire begins to evaporate.
And we saw that on Thursday. That so one of Iran's demands was that look, there's got to be a ceasefire in place between Hezbollah and Israel. You can't ignore Hezbollah. Hezbollah has to be part of this. And if it's not, then we're not going to. This process is dead. So the Trump administration, and I'm not sure it was Trump. May have been J.D. Vance, but they pressed forward and put pressure on Israel, and Israel caved.
So before treating this moment as a genuine turning point. It is worth asking a harder question. If this ceasefire is only the surface, then what exactly lies underneath it? And where does Iran actually stand beneath that surface? To understand this crisis properly, we need to reset the frame. A great deal of Western analysis still describes Iran in familiar terms: sanctioned, isolated, economically constrained, regionally pressured, and strategically cornered. And at a surface level, that picture is not entirely false. Iran has been under pressure for years. Its economy has absorbed repeated shocks. Its room for maneuver has often looked narrow. But in geopolitics, pressure does not automatically mean weakness. Being contained is not the same as being stripped of leverage. And that is where many readings of Iran begin to fail. The first reason is geography. Iran sits in one of the most sensitive strategic positions in the world. It is not simply another state under sanctions. It is a state located next to one of the most critical energy choke points on the planet, with direct proximity to shipping lanes that matter far beyond the Middle East. That alone gives Tehran a kind of relevance that cannot be erased by political isolation. Geography does not disappear because a country is under pressure. In many cases, geography is precisely what keeps that country dangerous. The second reason is strategic depth. Iran is not the kind of target that lends itself to a quick and clean resolution. Its size, its terrain, its internal structure, and defensive preparation all make the fantasy of a short war deeply questionable. Any assumption that Iran can be simply shocked into submission ignores the basic reality that this is a state built to absorb pressure, survive under siege conditions.
Economic pressure on Iran that they're going to have to cave. And I'm looking, has anybody paid attention to Cuba over the last 66 years? We've had a pretty effective blockade on Cuba, and yet, they're still standing, and they don't have any of the advantages that Iran does. I mean, Cuba's an island. Cuba doesn't have vast natural resources other than some great tobacco and great cigars. Here's Iran, which has, it's got Turkmenistan on its border. It can interact freely, travel through there. Goods can come in. The same with the Caspian Sea and direct access to Russia.
And continue functioning even while under attack. That makes any fast, decisive outcome far less likely than many outside observers assume. The third factor is the structure of Iran's military power. Iran does not rely on a single exposed center of gravity. Its military structure is layered, dispersed, and in many cases buried. Its missile capabilities matter not only because of what they can hit, but because they complicate planning for any adversary trying to impose escalation without consequences. Its ability to disperse assets and preserve retaliatory capacity means that even under sustained pressure, Iran is not easily reduced to silence. This is a state designed not for elegant power projection, but for endurance, retaliation, and persistence. And that leads to the most important point. Iran does not need to defeat the United States in the traditional sense. It does not need to clear a battlefield for victory. It does not need to overpower Washington conventionally. What it needs to do is much simpler and in some ways much more effective. Raise the cost of American success to the point where success itself becomes politically, economically, and strategically unstable. That is the logic of asymmetric power. The common mistake is to judge Iran by the standards of conventional war, as if the only meaningful question is how it performs in a direct force-on-force comparison with the United States. But Tehran does not operate primarily through that logic. Its strength lies in its ability to create disruption, to extend timelines, widen risk, and erode the confidence of stronger opponents. It aims not necessarily to win cleanly, but to make sure the other side cannot win cleanly either. And the most dangerous instrument in that strategy is not a slogan, not a speech, and not even a missile battery. It is a strategic choke point in the global economy, the Strait of Hormuz. The Strait of Hormuz is not just a narrow stretch of water on the map. It is one of the most critical choke points in the global energy system. And that is precisely why it remains Iran's most dangerous strategic card.
They're like, as long as the US has a blockade, we're gonna shut down the Strait of Hormuz again. And Trump is saying he's gonna keep the blockade until they reach a deal.
Not because Tehran needs to shut it down completely, and not because it needs some dramatic act of total closure to make its point. In reality, a full blockade is not even necessary. Iran only needs to make this corridor feel unstable, risky, and unpredictable. That alone can be enough to send shockwaves through the market, because global systems do not wait for certainty. They react to risk. If shipping companies begin to fear disruption, if insurers start pricing in the danger, if traders believe that route is no longer secure, then the damage begins before any formal closure ever takes place. And once that process starts, the impact spreads very quickly beyond oil. Yes, oil is the first thing people think about, and for obvious reasons. But Hormuz matters far more than just crude. It affects LNG flows, maritime transport, shipping costs, insurance premiums, and the confidence that keeps global trade moving.
The reality of a 20% reduction in the supply of global oil, that is real. The same for liquid natural gas, the same for helium. And that is having an economic effect that's going to drag down the world economy. There's no way to avoid this. Even if today let's say that Iran finally said, okay, we agree with Trump. We're going to do everything that Trump wants. The blockade is lifted. Everything is turned back on, and that goes with the assumption that there's not been damage to the ability of the Gulf Arabs to actually pump oil now. But it just assumes that everything's perfect. It's going to be 2 months, minimum 2 months before the supply is back to.
From there, the pressure spreads outward into fertilizer markets, industrial supply chains, electronic production, and the broader manufacturing system that depends on stable energy and transport costs. What begins as a regional security problem can rapidly become a global inflation problem. That is the larger point here. War does not stay on the battlefield. In a system as interconnected as this one, conflict moves directly into fuel prices, logistic costs, food prices, input cost for industry, and ultimately the cost of living far from the original flashpoint. The front line is not only where missiles fly, it is also where containers stall, where shipping rates climb, where producers start recalculating costs under stress. And what makes this even more serious is that the economic impact does not end when the shooting slows down.
About the impact of the war is going to be felt for months to come anyway, even if the war is ended.
Even if the immediate military tension eases, the aftershock can linger for months.
We'll see the economic impacts of. We're going to see the economic impacts of this war, even if there's a peace deal tomorrow.
Markets remember instability. Insurance does not instantly fall back to normal. Shipping routes do not immediately regain confidence. Supply chains do not repair themselves overnight. Once uncertainty enters a system, it continues to distort behavior long after the visible face of the crisis appears to calm down. So, the real cost of Hormuz is not just disruption at the moment. It is the durability of the disruption after the moment has passed. And that is where the question starts to reverse itself. If this confrontation turns into a prolonged contest of pressure and attrition, then which economy can actually endure that kind of strain for long? In terms of raw firepower, the United States is overwhelmingly superior. That much is not really in dispute. But superiority in firepower is not the same thing as having a realistic path to victory.
Well, look, the the United States actually has limited military operations. I disagree with Professor Pape on the so-called ground operation. Yes, the United States is considering right now inserting special operations forces to go after the highly enriched uranium. That would be, in fact, I saw one of these generals on television saying, "Yeah, it'd take 10,000 troops to do it, but yeah, we could do it." And I'm going, okay. Do you realize the C-130, which is the most likely aircraft that would be used to insert troops? One C-130 can carry 90 paratroopers with a combat load. 90. Okay, so just do the math. You've got so you need 10,000 troops. You're going to need what was that?
And that is the distinction that matters here. The real question is not whether Washington can inflict damage. Of course it can. The real question is whether any of its available tools can produce a durable political outcome at an acceptable cost. Start with a ground invasion. In practical terms, this is close to unrealistic. Iran is too large, too populated, too geographically difficult, and too politically complex to fit the model of a quick military solution. Any major ground operation would carry enormous risks from the outset. The terrain favors defense. The population base is large. The capacity for resistance, both formal and informal, would be significant. And the political cost, not just regionally, but domestically and internationally, would be immense. This is not the kind of theater where a modern military simply enters, imposes order, and exits on favorable terms.
You're going to need hundreds of C-130s to do that, and then where do they land? Or if you're going to conduct an actual invasion of Iran, because when I hear ground, we've got the ground operations, you're talking something like what we did to Iraq in 2003, where the United States assembled forces, 165,000 in Kuwait and Saudi Arabia, and then went roaring across the border. Well, we don't really have that luxury. We could assemble those troops right now in Kuwait or Saudi Arabia, but they're within range of even the short-range ballistic missiles out of Iran, not to mention the medium-range or intermediate-range ballistic missiles and cruise missiles. So it's just the United States is not in a position. One, we don't have the forces. I mean, the Army's total strength right now is 452,000. What you'd be talking about is trying to assemble a ground force of, there's just no practical.
Then there is the idea of a naval blockade. On paper, it sounds tough. It sounds decisive. It sounds like the kind of measure a superpower can impose to squeeze an adversary without going into full war. But sustaining a blockade over time is far harder than announcing one. It creates constant opportunities for friction, miscalculation, and unintended escalation. It also assumes that the pressure at sea will translate into political surrender on land. And that assumption is far from guaranteed. A blockade may signal resolve, but signaling resolve is not the same as forcing compliance.
It was not a real blockade. I mean, you don't have enough ships. The U.S. doesn't have enough ships deployed to actually do an effective blockade. And but even the entire premise of a blockade is nonsensical, because
then there is large-scale air power. This is probably the option most likely to appear attractive in Washington, precisely because it seems to offer coercion without occupation. And yes, airstrikes could inflict real damage. They could hit infrastructure, command nodes, launch sites, and selected strategic targets. But even there, the limits are serious. Deeply buried facilities, dispersed systems, hardened sites, and a military structure built for survival are not easy to erase from the air. More importantly, destruction from above does not automatically create political collapse below. It certainly does not guarantee regime change.
It's the limits of air power. You can only bomb so much, and when people are underground and they've got a bunker, underground bunkers and are protected, you can't destroy all that. The only way to actually destroy that is to put troops in on the ground and go in and fight a land war. Um, and that this has been a sort of a fantasy of the Air Force, Army Air Corps. Yeah, it goes back to World War II. They actually the planners in both the UK and the United States believed that they just dropped enough bombs that they would force Germany to surrender, and that turned out not to be true. So, but that has persisted. U.S. did it again, tried to do it in Vietnam.
That illusion has appeared many times before. Great powers often assume that enough bombing will break an opponent's will and produce the desired political order. But from Vietnam to Afghanistan, from Iraq to the struggle against the Houthis, history keeps showing the same thing. Bombs can only destroy assets, but they do not by themselves build stable outcomes. So the point is not that the United States lacks military power. It's that military power by itself does not guarantee a sustainable end state. America can strike very hard, but striking hard is not the same as producing a lasting result. There is another danger here, and it may be even more serious than the military question. If Washington truly believes that enough pressure will cause Iranian society to rise up in the direction the United States wants, then that may be one of the most dangerous illusions in the entire crisis. Because internal dissatisfaction is not the same thing as political alignment with outside pressure. A population can be frustrated with its government, angry at its economic hardship, exhausted by repression, and still refuse to side with a foreign power trying to force change from the outside. In fact, history often suggests the opposite. When a society feels externally threatened, internal divisions do not always widen. Sometimes they narrow. Sometimes pressure from abroad creates exactly the kind of defensive cohesion that outside strategists fail to anticipate. That is what makes this kind of assumption so risky. It turns a deeply complex society into a simplified political fantasy. It assumes that pressure automatically produces fracture, that fracture automatically produces uprising, and that uprising automatically produces a government more favorable to outside interests. But none of those steps is guaranteed. In many cases, none of them happen at all. And this is where intelligence failure becomes a serious concern. Not necessarily failure in the narrow technical sense, but distortion in how information is processed. Intelligence can be politicized. Warning signs can be filtered through ideology. Assessments can become shaped by what leaders want to hear rather than by what the situation actually supports. And once that happens, decision makers begin operating inside of a closed loop of overconfidence. They stop reading the opponent as it is, and they start reading it as they need it to be. That is when strategic error becomes more likely. Because the most dangerous great power is not the one that is weak. It is the one that is so powerful for so long that it begins to mistake its own assumptions for reality. There is also the question of political control. And here, Donald Trump becomes a major variable. Not simply because of his rhetoric, but because he has long shown a highly unpredictable decision-making style. He can escalate quickly, reverse course suddenly, and shift tone without much warning. That kind of unpredictability can sometimes be presented as strategic ambiguity. But in a crisis like this, it can also signal something much more dangerous. A policy-making environment shaped by impulse, image management, personal instinct, and the pressures of domestic politics.
So Tuesday morning, whatever that was, 10 days ago, he announced that he was about to end Iranian civilization. And then a few hours later, he said, oh, this is a great day for the Middle East.
And that matters. Because when foreign policy is driven by volatility or by distorted information filtered through political need, the risk level rises very quickly. A crisis that might otherwise remain containable becomes much harder to manage when key decisions are influenced by ego, timing, media pressure, or the need to project strength for internal political reasons. In that kind of environment, coherence weakens, and the margin for miscalculation narrows. But Trump is only one part of the picture. Israel is another central force in this equation, and its role cannot be treated as secondary. From Israel's perspective, any outcome that leaves Iran stronger, more stable, or more politically normalized is deeply problematic. If Tehran emerges from this crisis with greater room to maneuver, or with its regional position intact, that may be seen in Tel Aviv not as de-escalation, but as strategic failure. That creates a built-in source of pressure. What may look to Washington like a sufficient stopping point, a deal that freezes escalation and avoids wider war, may not look sufficient at all from the Israeli side. For Israel, a pause that allows Iran to recover may be worse than continued confrontation. And once that divergence appears, the crisis becomes harder to stabilize because the actors involved are no longer working towards the same threshold of acceptable risk. And when a confrontation contains this many centers of power, each pulling in a different direction, the danger of miscalculation almost always rises. Now, Lebanon is one of the clearest indicators of how Iranian influence actually works in the region. If we want to understand Tehran's reach in the Middle East, we cannot ignore Hezbollah, because Hezbollah is not just a military force, and treating it as if it were only an armed faction misses the larger reality. It is embedded in political life, in community structures, in social networks, in an organizational ecosystem that extends well beyond the battlefield.
That it ever has been. And over the years, in the 1980s, Hezbollah, let's call them more, I'll say they're more of a criminal outfit. I mean, they were a militant. They didn't have a sort of a political vision. But today, 45 years later, Hezbollah is they are a state within a state. I mean, they're They've
Yeah.
got political, social, economic. It's not just military. Um, they are an organic entity, and so it's not just a matter of getting them to stop fighting.
That is why the simple formula, disarm them and move on, does not hold up under serious analysis. Hezbollah is not a switch that can be turned off by declaration. It's not a loose instrument that can be removed from the regional equation without reshaping the political and social ground around it. Any effort to view it only through a military lens will almost certainly misunderstand what gives it resilience in the first place. Because networks like this do not survive by weapons alone. They survive through local legitimacy in parts of the population, through institutional presence, through community protection, and through the role they play in a broader regional balance of power. That does not mean they are invulnerable. It means they are rooted. And rooted actors are far more difficult to erase than outside planners often assume. This matters because it reveals something larger about Iran's regional strategy.
Hezbollah is is the de facto authority in Lebanon these days, because the government is composed of confessional elements, with a Maronite Christian always the president, with a Sunni Muslim as the prime minister, and a Shiite speaker in parliament. But the demographics of Lebanon no longer conform to that constitutional arrangement. It's now got a very large Shiite majority, and Hezbollah is in effect the only effective defense force that Lebanon has. So this is another problem. Israel's objectives in Lebanon include disarming Hezbollah, and it wants to rely on the Lebanese government to do that. And the Lebanese government would probably love to do that, because that would restore its authority, which has been diluted by Hezbollah. And in fact, you have a game going on there where the Lebanese government, which once accepted Iranian backing, which once accepted that it was in an Iranian-Syrian sphere of influence, now wants to be in an Israeli sphere of influence, collude with Israel against its internal opposition. That internal opposition will not accept Israeli dominance of Lebanese politics. So I'm not sure how long this so-called ceasefire is going to last.
Tehran's influence is not built only on direct state power, but it is also built through layered networks, political relationships, and actors that are woven into local realities. That kind of influence cannot simply be bombed away or administratively dismantled. And that is exactly why any solution meant to last has to move through politics, not just through military force. If there is still a workable off-ramp in this crisis, it is unlikely to come through total victory for either side. It would have to come through a practical compromise. At the most basic level, that could mean Iran accepting some form of limitation on its nuclear program in exchange for meaningful sanctions release. The release of frozen assets, and at least a partial reopening of economic space. In other words, not a grand settlement that resolves everything, but a narrow arrangement designed to reduce pressure, lower the immediate risk of escalation, and create a framework for temporary stability. That is probably the most realistic version of diplomacy still available. But it immediately runs into the hardest part of the equation. Iran's regional allies and aligned movements are not the kind of assets Tehran can simply trade away like bargaining chips on a table. From the Iranian perspective, these relationships are not only tools of leverage, they are also part of a wider deterrence architecture. They extend Iran's strategic depth, complicate pressure from the outside, and help prevent the country from being isolated in purely territorial terms. That makes them far more valuable than a disposable concession. And this is where many diplomatic fantasies begin to collapse. If one side still expects the other to accept something close to strategic surrender, then there is no real negotiation taking place. There's only coercion with diplomatic language wrapped around it. A functioning settlement requires both sides to accept less than total victory. The moment one side insists on complete rollback, complete submission, or permanent weakness for the other, the space for genuine compromise begins to disappear. So yes, diplomacy still exists here, but it exists as a very narrow opening, not a broad road to resolution. It is a path available under only limited conditions, and it could close very quickly. One new strike, one political provocation, one move interpreted as bad faith, and the entire opening could collapse before it ever matures into something durable.
I know that the ambitions of the various parties who have temporarily joined the ceasefire, to some extent, are there's no common ground between them, and this is the problem with everything the amateur team from the United States has been doing, whether it's in Ukraine or in Gaza or with Iran. There's no meeting of the minds to underpin alleged agreements. I mean, you're a businessman. You can do a deal in many ways. Nobody negotiates unless they're either going to gain something or lose something if they don't. That's true. And but in the end, you can't claim there's an agreement when there's no agreement. And the fundamental issues have not been ironed out.
That is the reality of this moment. There is still a door to diplomacy, but it is a very narrow one, and it does not take much to slam it shut. So in the end, this is not just a confrontation between a superpower and a sanctioned state. It is a test of the real limits of American power in a changing world. The first point is simple. This ceasefire is too fragile to be called stability. The second, Iran is not weak in the way many still assume, because it holds serious asymmetric leverage. And the third, the United States may still dominate militarily, but that does not mean it has a clear political path to victory. That is why this crisis matters far beyond the Middle East. It suggests that the old unipolar order no longer works as smoothly as it once did. China, Russia, BRICS countries, and even US allies will all be watching the same question. How much power can Washington still convert into real control? And the biggest danger right now is not that the war has already fully exploded. It is that many people may think the worst is over. Because if the core contradictions are still there, then one wrong move, one overreaction, or one outside actor pushing too far could bring everything back to the edge.
To its aggression against Lebanon. But I'd caution you that the phony ceasefire in Lebanon is no more real than the one in Gaza, or for that matter, the one in the Strait of Hormuz. We have, you mentioned 9 or 10 wars that Trump claims to have ended. Actually, none of them have ended.
This war may not be in full eruption today, but if nothing fundamental has been resolved, then de-escalation may simply be another word for the silence before the next storm. Thanks for watching, and make sure you follow us to see the next episode.